What's up, metal and heavy music fans? Today we are ranking the third albums from classic death metal bands.
Let the children come to me. The mother loves me, so shall they.
Alright, and as usual, to challenge myself, I am only allowing 4 per tier, and I've relabeled them too, so that people don't get as upset about some of the lower tiers. They still will anyways, but let's get right down to it with Morbid Angel and Covenant. So obviously, big breakthrough album, thanks in part to God of Emptiness being featured on Beavis and Butthead, actually. More satanic and religious themes on this album. It ended up influencing bands like Portal and Dead Congregation, among many others. More fusion here of the heavy elements with the also more atmospheric side on tracks like Rapture, Vengeance is Mine, and World of Shit. Also, plenty of great riffs and dynamic moments, making for an all-around more memorable experience, I would say, personally. And out of this batch, I'm going to go ahead and put it up at Perfection tier. Strong start. All right, next up we have Nile with In Their Darkened Shrines. So now we're at the third critically lauded album from this band. Very strong early discography. More great little touches of additional atmosphere as usual. Now, I will say, I don't like the production as much on this one, as all of the chaos of the instrumentation in the crazier spots especially starts to turn into like one big muddled mess, and something about the vocals just feels a little bit off in places too. But aside from that, this is another incredible display of instrumentation and songwriting from Carl. This album also has their longest song at 18 minutes, if you're not breaking it into the little parts that they've kind of segmented it into, but personally, I think I'm partial to the short but sweet Wind of Horus. I'm going to put this one at fantastic. Immolation, Failures for Gods. So, you all know, if you watched my overall, band rankings for death metal, that I'm a big Immolation fan at this point, but this album has kind of some pros and cons. I think it steps up the atmosphere fitting to the album cover. It's got this kind of blizzard sound to it that just really surrounds you. But as far as the songwriting goes, I'm not really blown away. There's definitely some skull-bashing moments of technicality with the likes of Failures for Gods and Stench of High Heaven, and some cool soloing too, with just an awesome sound to them. So I'm going to kind of split the difference on this one and say that I think this album is good. It's not one of my favorites in their discography, but still good in its own right. And of course, as always, this is just my opinion. Share your own down in the comments. There is no such thing as an objective ranking when it comes to music, unless you're a narcissistic piece of shit. Moving on, we have Cryptopsy with Whisper Supremacy. So Mike DeSalvo stepping in on vocals for this album, which does change up the sound a little bit. Miguel Roy also brings some changes to the riffs. Overall, it still sounds very much like a Cryptopsy album, but lacks some of the visceral heaviness of the previous two, opting for kind of a midpoint between Floridian death metal and Gothenburg death metal. It's craterous in its own way and bringing its own strengths to the table. Ultimately, I do appreciate that unlike some other death metal discographies, each of their albums has its own kind of distinct personality, but my biggest point of detraction on this one is probably the vocals, which are very one note and can be a little grating at times, and then some of the songwriting also just feels a little bit messier. So I'm going to put this one at great. Alright, then we have 6 Feet Under with Maximum Violence. The nicest thing I can say is that it's not the worst thing I've ever heard, and it's definitely better than their later albums. I'm really not a big 6 Feet Under fan, as regular viewers know. It's fine, I guess, but of the choices here, it seems obvious that this belongs at the bottom. Again, if you disagree, if you have a strong argument of why this is better than, say, Covenant, have at it in the comments, and God save you from the replies. But let's move on to Incantation with Diabolical Conquest. So the drum kick on this one actually kind of reminds me of early Gorguts, which I actually dig. I know it's sort of memeable, but it's fun. It makes for a really heavy, special kind of sound. This is the only album with Daniel Corchado of The Chasm on vocals, and he sounds great, to be honest. He has a great fit. I kind of wish he would have been on more of their discography, because I just think he brings something really special to it. The songwriting's also more chaotic. I feel like all of their best qualities really form Voltron here. You've got the insidious serpent-like doom riffs, the noisy, squealy parts on Disciples of Blasphemous Reprisal. Just a really well-rounded album with great pacing and all the band's strengths at their peak. I'm going to finally give them their due. Incantation fans rejoice, because I know they've been upset with the previous tier lists at where I've placed them. this is going at S tier. All right, but then Obituary, the end complete, still have kind of the same feeling about Obituary. Just, I don't know, it's just not exactly my thing, but I appreciate some of it. Alan West coming back here for guitar from the debut, and this album actually made number 16 on Billboard Heatseekers, so respect where it's due. It's certainly not a bad album, but already at this point in their discography, it just feels like a rehash without the same impact. A few of these tracks are a little bit more on the bland side, like In the End of Life. There are some stronger parts too, though, but it's just not enough to keep me fully engaged. Will say the drums sound great, but I'm going to piss Obituary fans off again and put this down at what would be C, but again, what I've relabeled as good, because that's ultimately what that tier really means, is that it's not bad, it's not fantastic, but it's still good. All right, Suffocation, Pierced from Within. This album feels much tighter, both in production and performance, than the previous two albums, I would say. Carrying over the growth from those, but now complemented with a heavier mix and more memorable riffs. Some slower parts here, like the opening of Torn into Enthrallment, flexing their dynamics and abilities. Still very much a 90s death metal album, but this is the point where I actually start banging my head to tracks like Depths of Depravity and Blood Hatred. Some killer solos going on here too. This is an upper tier one for Suffocation. In terms of the competition on this particular list, it still doesn't make quite the top two, but it's up there on great tier. Then we have Cannibal Corpse with Tomb of the Mutilated, another very strong release in a pretty consistent discography. Obviously, this has the classic hammer smashed face on it. It was also my introduction to the band, with such hits as I Come Blood, Split Wide Open, and Addicted to Vaginal Skin. What's not to love? Like, really, out of their early discography, I would say this and The Bleeding are kind of like the highest ranked for me, and I think it's better than Butchered at Birth, personally. Again, with the competition here, I don't think it quite makes perfection, but it definitely deserves to be at fantastic. All right, Bolt Thrower, another common point of contention on these videos. So this drops a lot of the grind influences of the previous album for more groove-focused death metal. This is also apparently the final album to have blast beats, which was kind of interesting when I was looking at little factoids for these. Found this one to be a little bit boring, though, in comparison. Compositions just aren't as interesting to me. Again, the doomier parts may just not be up my alley, which is going to be the case on another album here, even though Incantation, again, did rise to the top, because I just think they did it more effectively. This particular style of it, just, I don't know, maybe it just overall doesn't work for me, but that said, people always get mad in the comments at my continued kind of lower to mid rankings of Bolt Thrower, but I just don't find them to be as impressive as a lot of the other stuff on these lists, so I'm going to put them at good tier. Again, not bad, good, just not my favorite. All right, Vader, Back to the Blind. I feel like kind of like the forgotten album in their discography that gets overlooked. I even said when I did my Vader tier list that somehow I thought I had listened to every single album, but had somehow skipped this one. And it's just, it kind of fits because I just find it to be very forgettable. Like, there are some cool moments on here, there's some heavy elements, but it feels like a step back both in songwriting and production from De Profundis, and it doesn't feel nearly as strong as the albums that come after. So ultimately, in the competition here, I'm going to also put this at okay, not my thing. But Gorguts, we finally did it. We got to Obscura. It's been painful to go through the first and second album's videos and have to rank Gorguts so low, but now we get to the album where Gorguts finally becomes Gorguts. Like, they truly come into their own, and from the very start, this is just pure dissonance, that avant-garde approach to songwriting that they've become synonymous with, some weird flourishes of strings thrown in there too. There are so many bands that have been launched too as a result of where this album took them, and it's regarded as one of the most important albums in technical death metal for good reason. Gotta be at S tier. In fact, I would put it higher than Covenant. All right, Deicide, Once Upon a Cross. I actually appreciate the increased infectiousness of the groove on this particular album. It's a pretty good time. Fun one in their discography, something that I rank pretty highly overall in all of their own albums. The opening title track and Christ Denied feel like a return to more anthemic vocal lines. So solid, fun, if not a little bit unremarkable, again, in comparison to some of the stark competition on this list. So I'm going to put it at great tier. On the flip side, we have Atheist with Elements, and I keep saying, like, Atheist was just way ahead of their time. And as I was re-listening to this one, I was kind of realizing that this is basically like an alternate universe where, like, Primus decided to make death metal instead of the direction that they went. The bass absolutely cooks in that kind of like less Claypool kind of style, and then the drumming and guitar work are just in a complete league of their own. Completely different style than what anyone else is doing. You've got those like crazy little flamenco style acoustic sections. The vocals do get a little bit goofier in places on this one, but on some level that also just adds to the uniqueness of it within the genre. I don't think it's quite as tight as the first two, which I would easily pick over this one. It's a little looser, a little jammier, and it does kind of go overboard with some of the soloing in places. It feels more almost like a live performance. But even so, the musicianship and innovation here still make it more interesting to me than even some of the classics on this list. I'm going to put it way up high on the fantastic tier. All right, so that other album I mentioned in the doomier style that I'm just not a big fan of is Autopsy. So another common sticking point in the comments every time I put up one of these videos, Autopsy and C, Autopsy and D, unsubscribed, clicking away from video. How dare I have a different opinion? I mean, how great would it be if we all just thought exactly the same, right? Like, that would be super fun. No, it wouldn't. Like, that's boring. This is what makes music fun to talk about. So personally, just in my humble opinion, I'm just not a big fan of their style. They have a very kind of like repetitious approach to songwriting that in general I don't like. And then you add in the kind of like more boring doomy elements on here, and it just doesn't do it for me. So it's going in, okay, not my thing. Pestilence, Testimony of the Ancients. So quick clarification on the previous video, I was talking shit about current vocalist Patrick and not Martin Van Drunen, who did vocals on the previous albums. But now here is where Spacey Boy Patrick himself takes over, moving up from just guitar duties on the previous one. I like the intro to the album and the synth additions, makes tracks like The Secrecies of Horror almost feel like a death metal Dimmu Borgir. Just tons of atmosphere. It does feel more like pure just death worship though in both the songwriting and especially the vocal performances. Patrick just can't hold a candle to Martin, in my opinion. Still lots of great guitar work, of course. Credit where it's due, and expanded dynamics too, better production, but it can be a little bit meandering and unfocused. Some of the interludes just feel sort of unnecessary. Even with all that said, it's still a very good album. It just is maybe not as good as many of the albums above it. So I'm going to put it at the higher end of good tier. Next up is Entombed, another controversial one here with Wolverine Blues. So moving into that death and roll sound. Some people love this album. In fact, in my Entombed tier list, quite a few people said that this was their number one and their favorite or close to the top for them. Me, not so much. I really don't care for this album much at all. And that's as somebody who enjoys Swan Song from Carcass, but this style, I don't know. This one just doesn't, I don't care for it. I still think it's one of their better albums in a very kind of strange and unique discography, but I just don't think that it can compete with the other albums on this list. And I'm wondering if people will at least agree with me on that. So I'm putting this one on okay, not my thing. Dying Fetus, Destroy the Opposition. So this is an absolute classic. This is what got me into Dying Fetus and also was a big gateway into just the more brutal side of the genre. Great songs and riffs. Praise the Lord is probably one of the most recognizable riffs of all time. Great drumming on the title track, more dynamic songwriting than the previous two. Crazy sweeps on this thing. The technicality is just crazy, especially for the time. And also each track is a little different. They have kind of a different personality, but it all sort of comes together. I would say it's not quite as good as, again, some of the others on this list, but it made Decibel's top 100, and I think it deserves at least a pretty high A. Then we have Death with Spiritual Healing. So a difference in vocal sound here is one of the things that kind of like distracts me on this album, as I mentioned when I was talking about their full discography. I think they've increased their songwriting ambition, but it also ends up a little bit more meandering. The production, like the vocal has this weird like doubling effect on it that I'm still kind of not sure how I feel about. Good tracks here, Living Monstrosity, Low Life, and Genetic Reconstruction are kind of the standouts for me. Not among my favorites of the Death discography, but still great, still strong on this list. I'm going to put it I'm going to put it pretty high up on great tier. And then it should be almost no surprise that we're going to end on Carcass with Necroticism descanting the Ensalubrious, and I got that in one take this time. That's impressive. This is the first album with Michael Amott, and more progressive death metal stylings on this one compared on some level to like a death metal Master of Puppets, I would say. Also, better production, just continuing to evolve from album to album pretty rapidly, and I love how they sort of change styles too. Lots of great tracks here with really fun names like Corporal Jigsaw Quandary, Symposium of Sickness, and Incarnated Solvent Abuse. Great titles for a great album. Should be, again, no surprise that I put yet another Carcass album at high on S tier. Y'all check out this playlist for plenty more metal tier lists, and check out this playlist for more death metal related videos. But that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.